Jared Gardner is here with us, and he traveled here from Portland. So he helped launch a Move Your Money campaign in Portland with Real Wealth of Portland, and now he's been working a lot on Oregonians for a state bank. So we have to look to him to see what we'll be doing 4 years from now. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. One of the joys of going last is you never know what the presenters before you are going to cover, and it presents this unique challenge of having most of my talking points already covered. So I'm scrambling back there covering and thinking, what can I add to what Christy said? What can I add to what our panelists said in terms of the differences between the Wall Street? I've heard a lot of bank language, but we're really talking about the Wall Street banks and the community banks and credit unions. There is a vast gulf between the two of them. So what can I add to what's already been said? I'll start with our history. I come from a group called the Real Wealth of Portland. It actually has roots and connections to the Economic Justice Action Group of First Unitarian Church in Portland. So here I am at your local Unitarian church, and it's nice to be in a fellow congregation. 2 years ago, in January, we hosted an economic crisis town hall. We had about 800 folks come out to explore what was going on in the middle of this crisis. And out of that, a lot of people had entered in the banking system. We're seeing the basic narrative that I think Christy covered really well is we have this implosion on Wall Street, then we have socialism sweep in to save capitalism, the $1 trillion of bailouts, then you have these long unemployment lines, and then you have big bank bonuses. That's the big bonuses. It's kind of the narrative of what we've seen in the last few years. The playing field is entirely tilted against our communities and in favor of these large institutions that control what their asset total is 60% of gross domestic product. That's not a healthy economy, and we need to do something about that. A Move Your Money campaign is a step in addressing those inequalities. In Oregon, for instance, where we're working on political campaigns as well as movements such as this, 15 years ago, when deregulation was really kicking into high gear before the last nails were in that coffin, we had 35% of our deposits, state deposits, in Wall Street banks. Today it's 60. The big banks went and lobbied Congress, National Congress, saying bigger is better. That's the story, right? Economy of scale. You release these restrictions and the consumer is going to benefit. And what did we see? We saw the entire economy shift in the wrong direction. I see some charts back there on the wall from Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Stacy Mitchell's the one that did most of that research, and it's very clear that the large institutions are the worst in terms of their fee schedules. The community banks, much lower. Credit unions, same thing. So they're taking our money from our communities, extracting it out of our communities, and chasing the highest return. Where is that right now? It's not in our rural towns especially. We're seeing corporate expansion in China being funded. We're seeing the large multinational banks funding mountaintop removals. If you want to talk about economic justice, that's where your Chase deposits have been leveraged into. You're seeing Wachovia is in the news right now for leveraging a bunch of returns off funneling and laundering drug traffic money from Mexico. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And somebody brought this to my attention. I said, well, that's not news. They've been doing that for decades. They've been in the news every few years. Just now we're starting to wake up and see that the banking system is tied to every single thing we care about in terms of environmental justice, social justice, the health of our communities. And to make those connections, that's really what this is about, this Move Your Money concept. How can we make those connections and then take action in our local communities? How can we move and bank with the business bank or the industrial credit union, or I was trying to remember all three of them and I lost it. North Coast, yes, just right up the road. We saw that when we drove in. And we need both. It really is, there is enough market share. I was looking at the stats that you're all working on. There's enough market share in Whatcom County to flood our local institutions and give them the resources they need to lend into our communities. And certainly without the banks doing affordable housing and housing development loans in general, which are needed, or say a commercial enterprise trying to do some capital improvements or buying a new building, without the community banks doing that, our local economies would really suffer. As one of the panelists mentioned, the credit unions are capped in terms of how much they can do with business banking. They do a great job on the consumer side. Somebody else asked out in the audience, what about rates? And when I've looked at rates, community banks, credit unions are always a margin higher in terms of what you get for your savings yields and always a step lower than what the rates are from when you obtain debt. So the stats are really clear that you as an individual get a better deal when you bank local, the communities get more lending when we all bank local, and the big banks are extracting wealth. So that's the main idea I'd want to reiterate here. Ideally, a moving money campaign is about us individuals moving our money, our businesses moving our money, our institutions, our churches moving their money, our city governments moving their money, ideally our state governments. There are limitations in terms of what can be done. So it's great to see the local mayor coming out to support this. He hit it on the head. There are limitations both federally and locally in terms of the amount of public funds that can be absorbed or put to productive use, I should say, with our institutions. And that's really what took us from a Move Your Money campaign in Portland, which I should say was exactly like this. We started, you had a forum in May of last year, I believe, and out of that, some energy, you start asking these questions, you put together this campaign, you're all here now, you're passing out flyers to educate, and you're doing something about it. Exactly what we were doing a few years ago. And as we were meeting with executives of banks and credit unions, we learned that there are structural issues as well. There's a whole financial system that banks and credit unions need to interface with in order to be productive. The corporate credit union model, it's that they have an entity that backstops credit unions, has hit really rocky times. They're in need of some shoring up. Certainly we have the larger financial institutions rocking the community banks where the liquidity's been pulled out from them. So they're trying to struggle because others on Wall Street have struggled. And the generality there is any viable business that has its liquidity or its lines of credit pulled out from underneath it, it's going to suffer. The best example are farmers. You think of a wheat farmer from eastern or central Washington, they need a whole bunch of money up front to plant. It grows, they hire people to come harvest, then they have the money later on. It's not basically a checking account like we're used to, or I should say a wage income where we get monthly paychecks. They put a lot of money in, have to live off of it, hope they get a good product at the end to sell. If you pull that line of credit out at the beginning and that farmer cannot plant, then they cannot have a crop, then they cannot hire local people to work for them, they cannot sell that food to have a profit. What's going to happen to their home mortgage? What's going to happen to their auto loans? What's going to happen to their equipment loans? What's going to happen to their business loans? They're not going to be able to make those payments. And that's really the root of why the Bank of North Dakota was started. In turn of the century, all the banks were out of state. They were all in Chicago. They were all saying, they controlled the market. And to North Dakotan farmers, they said, we're not going to give you your line of credit that you've always had. Well, nothing's changed for us. That's all right. We're just not so sure we want to lend to you anymore. Now we can't plant. That's going to be tough for you, huh? Come the next year, you didn't make your payments on your property. We're going to seize that property. The same banks that didn't provide the liquidity so that the same farm could actually produce a living. So what they saw in North Dakota was the Chicago banks sweeping in and taking all of their property. They said enough's enough, and a populist movement swept through North Dakota, and they established a state bank to add resilience to their local economies. What does a state bank do? I think there's a bunch of misconceptions to clear up. I know there's been a campaign in Washington. I've followed it loosely, but I've heard a number of things, and I was encouraged to speak a little bit on this topic as it relates to moving our institutional money. It's a non-retail entity. The Bank of North Dakota is the best example. It's what shores up the banking system. And North Dakota has the highest per capita number of community banks and credit unions. They've got 90 there. Oregon's got 30, 26 community banks, and then a handful of Wall Street ones. And yet they've got far, far fewer people. So it's almost like every little town's got its own community bank because they've got this institution that helps them level out the ups and downs and do what they do best. So when we realized the potential there, we started working with our treasurer's office, our local constituencies, the family farmers, people all across the political spectrum to say, what can we do to insulate our economy? So there was another question today of insulating our system against the outside, national, multinational interests in Wall Street. What can we do to shore that up and be more resilient? And that's where that concept comes in.